Welcome to Ryan Epic Explains, where power, strategy, and history are examined without illusion. In 1783, Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, formally recognizing American independence after 8 years of war. The most powerful empire on Earth had lost 13 colonies that represented barely 2% of its global territorial holdings. Within a generation, Britain would defeat Napoleon, dominate global maritime trade, and expand its empire to unprecedented scale. It possessed the world's largest navy, controlled strategic choke points across every ocean, and maintained military garrisons on 6 continents. Yet it never seriously attempted to reconquer the nation that had broken away from its control. This presents a historical paradox. Empires do not typically accept permanent loss of territory when they retain overwhelming military advantage. Spain fought for centuries to reclaim the Netherlands. France repeatedly invaded Italy. Russia systematically absorbed territories that had once slipped from imperial control. But Britain, which possessed greater relative power in 1812 than it had in 1776, which could have strangled American commerce at will, which faced a United States divided by regional interests and lacking professional military infrastructure, never mounted a campaign of reconquest. The restraint appears almost incomprehensible when viewed through the lens of pure capability. The central question is not whether Britain could have reconquered America. The question is, why strategic calculus made reconquest irrelevant even when Britain possessed the means to attempt it? When did the possibility of restoring colonial control transform from a viable option into a consideration that no serious British strategist would entertain? The answer lies not in sentiment or democratic sympathy, but in the cold mathematics of imperial resource allocation and the structural realities of early 19th century geopolitics. Within the first decades after American independence, British strategic planners understood something fundamental about power projection. Colonial control generates value only when the cost of maintaining that control remains lower than the economic extraction it enables. The American Revolution had demonstrated that the 13 colonies, unlike territories in the Caribbean or India, had developed sufficient political infrastructure and demographic density to make subjugation prohibitively expensive. The war had cost Britain approximately £120 million, at a time when total annual government revenue barely exceeded $12 million. More critically, it had required the deployment of significant naval and military resources that were simultaneously needed to defend against French and Spanish threats in the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean. British planners had learned that attempting to hold hostile territory 3,000 miles across an ocean, populated by millions of armed settlers with European military training, represented a strategic burden rather than an asset. When the War of 1812 began, Britain faced Napoleon at the height of his continental power. The Peninsular War consumed 40,000 British troops. Naval blockade of French ports required constant deployment of ships of the line. The economic warfare against French trade networks demanded resources across multiple theaters. In this context, the question was never whether Britain could defeat the United States militarily. The question was whether defeating the United States served any purpose that justified diverting resources from the existential European conflict. British strategists understood that even a successful invasion of American territory would require permanent garrison forces that could not be withdrawn without risking renewed rebellion. The United States, unlike India or African territories, possessed both the population density and the political cohesion to sustain prolonged resistance. Conquering American cities would be straightforward. Holding them indefinitely against a hostile population would drain resources needed elsewhere. The calculation became clearer when examining British economic interests. By 1810, American cotton exports to British textile mills had become integral to industrial production in Lancashire and Yorkshire. American grain exports helped feed Britain during European harvest failures. American shipping, despite official hostility, often served British commercial interests when officially neutral vessels could trade in ports closed to British flags. Total Anglo-American trade volume exceeded £20 million annually, even during periods of diplomatic tension. Reconquest would destroy this trade entirely and permanently. It would transform American commercial infrastructure into a perpetual hostile asset, requiring suppression rather than exploitation. British mercantile interests recognized that economic access to American markets and resources provided greater long-term value than political control that would necessitate military occupation. The British campaign against Washington in 1814 illustrated this strategic restraint. Forces under General Robert Ross burned government buildings in retaliation for American destruction of York in Upper Canada. Yet the operation was deliberately limited. No attempt was made to establish permanent occupation. No effort was devoted to destroying American economic infrastructure or seizing territorial control. The raid served as punitive demonstration, not as the opening phase of reconquest. British forces withdrew immediately after the symbolic destruction, making no attempt to consolidate position or to coordinate with subsequent operations against Baltimore or New Orleans. This was not mercy. It was strategic precision. The objective was to impose cost on American military adventurism, not to restore colonial governance. British planners understood that every week spent occupying American territory represented resources unavailable for European theaters where vital interests remained at stake. The aftermath of Napoleon's defeat in 1815 created conditions where reconquest might have appeared more feasible. Britain suddenly possessed vast available military capacity. The veteran army that had defeated French forces across Spain stood ready for deployment. The Royal Navy, no longer required to blockade continental ports, could concentrate overwhelming force in American waters. Yet even then, no serious proposal for American reconquest emerged in British strategic planning. The reason reflected calculation about what victory would actually require. Defeating American forces in open battle presented no particular difficulty. Occupying American territory long enough to restore colonial administration meant deploying perhaps 100,000 troops indefinitely across a vast geographic expanse where supply lines would extend thousands of miles over hostile terrain. The financial burden alone would exceed what American colonial revenues could ever justify. British attention had already shifted to more productive imperial acquisitions. The Congress of Vienna redistributed territories that offered strategic value without requiring the suppression of hostile European-descended populations. Cape Colony in South Africa provided control over the maritime route to India. Ceylon offered both commercial resources and strategic position. Trinidad and Tobago secured Caribbean interests. Malta guaranteed Mediterranean naval access. These territories, acquired through diplomatic negotiation rather than conquest, delivered tangible strategic benefits without the administrative nightmare of governing millions of armed Americans who had demonstrated willingness to sustain prolonged resistance. The calculus was not emotional. It was ruthlessly practical. Every pound spent attempting to restore colonial rule in America was a pound unavailable for securing interests that actually enhanced British global position. Economic interdependence created structural incentives against reconquest that operated independently of diplomatic relations. By the 1820s, American demand for British manufactured goods had made the United States one of Britain's largest export markets. British investment in American infrastructure, particularly canal and railroad construction, generated returns that depended on American political stability and economic growth. American agricultural exports, especially cotton, had become so integral to British industrial production that any disruption would have triggered economic crisis in Britain's most politically sensitive manufacturing regions. The relationship had evolved beyond simple colonial extraction. It had become a complex commercial network where British prosperity depended on American economic expansion. Reconquest would destroy this arrangement entirely. It would transform a profitable trading partner into a permanent financial drain, requiring military suppression. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 presented a moment where British strategic restraint became explicitly formalized through diplomatic architecture. When President Monroe declared that European powers should refrain from further colonization in the Americas, British Foreign Secretary George Canning recognized an opportunity. Rather than viewing the declaration as an affront to British prerogative, Canning understood it as alignment with British interests. Britain had no desire to see European rivals establish new American colonies that would require British military resources to counter. The Monroe Doctrine, backed implicitly by British naval power, even without formal alliance, served British strategic purposes by preventing competitors from gaining American footholds while requiring no British commitment of force. Canning's support for American hemispheric autonomy was not ideological sympathy. It was recognition that American independence, particularly when aligned against European colonial expansion, reduced British security obligations without sacrificing British commercial access. Throughout the mid-19th century, moments of Anglo-American tension repeatedly demonstrated this underlying calculation. The Oregon boundary dispute of the 1840s saw both nations deploy rhetoric suggesting possible conflict. Yet resolution came through negotiation precisely because neither side perceived sufficient value in the contested territory to justify actual war. The Trent Affair during the American Civil War brought Britain and the Union to the edge of military confrontation when Union forces removed Confederate diplomats from a British vessel. British strategic planners prepared for possible war while simultaneously calculating whether such a war served any British interest. The conclusion was negative. War with the Union would disrupt cotton supplies, threaten Canadian territory to American invasion, and provide no compensating strategic benefit. Britain pursued diplomatic resolution not from weakness, but from recognition that military victory would deliver nothing worth its cost. The American Civil War itself presented Britain with perhaps its last theoretical opportunity to fragment the United States through support for Confederate independence. A divided America would have been easier to influence and less capable of challenging British interests in the hemisphere. Yet Britain remained neutral, refusing to recognize the Confederacy despite significant British economic interests in Southern cotton. The reason was partly moral opposition to slavery, but more fundamentally, it reflected calculation about long-term strategic consequences. Supporting the Confederacy risked permanent hostility with whichever American faction ultimately prevailed. It guaranteed disruption of transatlantic trade. Most critically, it would have required British military commitment to ensure Confederate survival, transforming Britain into a guarantor of an economically weaker American state, while alienating the more industrially productive northern states. The strategic arithmetic indicated that whatever short-term advantage might come from American division would be outweighed by the long-term costs of involvement. By the latter half of the 19th century, the question of reconquering America had become not merely impractical, but conceptually obsolete. The United States had developed industrial capacity approaching Britain's own. American population had grown to 50 million. The transcontinental expansion created strategic depth that made invasion virtually impossible to sustain. More importantly, the nature of British imperial interests had evolved. Britain's global position depended increasingly on financial networks, commercial relationships, and naval access, rather than direct territorial control. The United States, as an independent economic power with compatible commercial systems and shared language, provided more value to British interests as an autonomous partner than it ever could have as a rebellious colonial possession requiring permanent military occupation. The strategic inevitability of British acceptance became visible in the gradual alignment of British and American interests across multiple domains. Both nations benefited from open maritime commerce and freedom of navigation. Both opposed European territorial expansion in the Americas. Both required stable financial systems and predictable commercial law. These structural alignments emerged not from sentiment, but from the practical reality that British global power and American hemispheric dominance were complementary rather than contradictory. Attempting to reverse American independence would have required Britain to sacrifice these alignments for the dubious benefit of governing a hostile population that would drain resources indefinitely. The lesson embedded in British strategic restraint operates beyond the specific historical case. Power projection has limits defined not by capability, but by sustainable cost. Empires expand when the marginal benefit of additional territory exceeds the marginal cost of controlling it. They contract or accept loss when that equation reverses. Britain possessed overwhelming military advantage over the United States throughout the 19th century. What it lacked was any strategic logic that would make reconquest worth attempting. The decision was never formally announced because no decision was ever required. The question simply faded from strategic relevance as the costs of reconquest became obviously prohibitive and the benefits became obviously illusory. Rivalries end not through dramatic confrontation or explicit reconciliation, but through the quiet recognition that continuation serves no interest. Britain never tried to reconquer America again because reconquest offered nothing that justified its cost. The empire that controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface understood that power is meaningful only when directed toward achievable objectives that enhance, rather than drain, imperial capacity. American independence was accepted because accepting it served British interests better than the alternative. Strategy, in the end, is simply the intelligent allocation of finite resources toward objectives that actually matter. History closes questions not through proclamation, but through the accumulated weight of calculations that make certain options structurally irrelevant.